Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. I never planned to return to my grandfather's crumbling Victorian house, but when he died and left it to me, I came home. I didn't expect the HOA next door to declare war over it. They wanted my land for their dream project. What they got was a battle they'd never forget. I never imagined my life would circle back to the creaky steps and ivy-covered walls of my grandfather's old Victorian home. But fate has a strange sense of symmetry. My name is Evan Miller. I'm 39, and I've spent the last decade restoring buildings for other people. Historic preservation was always my passion, born out of summers spent under the rafters of that sprawling, time-worn house on Sycamore Hill. So when Grandpa passed and left the property to me, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like the final chapter of a story we'd started together long ago. The house was built in 1905, a true Victorian beauty with turret windows, steep gables, and woodwork you just don't see anymore. 3 acres of land wrapped around it like a protective cloak, oak trees older than most of the town, a rusted iron gate at the end of the gravel drive, and a porch swing that groaned like it remembered every conversation ever had on it. This house had a soul. I grew up chasing fireflies across that lawn, sneaking into the attic to read comics while Grandpa worked in his study downstairs, pipe smoke curling beneath the door like a guardian spirit. Coming back to it didn't feel like starting over. It felt like coming home. Of course, the neighborhood around it had changed. 10 years ago, a developer bought the land that used to be cornfields and turned it into Maple Hollow Preserve, an upscale master-planned community with identical beige homes, imported hedges, and a homeowners association so tightly wound it might snap in half. They fenced themselves in like they were guarding the holy grail of suburbia, but my grandfather never sold. His house stood untouched, alone and proud, right in the center of their artificial perfection. A stubborn relic of the past they couldn't quite erase. When I moved in full-time 6 months ago, it was clear my property made the HOA nervous. Their residents drove by slowly, eyes wide, like they were watching a haunted mansion grow legs. My mailbox was flooded with newsletters I never signed up for. They even sent me a welcome basket, which included a pamphlet on approved lawn maintenance heights. I ignored it all. Because here's the truth. My home may be surrounded by their fences, but it will never be part of their little kingdom. This land has history. It has roots. And unlike their perfectly spaced saplings, mine run deep. It was a Wednesday afternoon when Karen Grace made her first official appearance on my doorstep. I'd seen her before, of course, hovering around the edges of my property line in her spotless beige SUV, sunglasses perched on her head like a crown, clipboard in hand as if she were performing a neighborhood exorcism. But that day, she didn't hover. She marched right up to my porch like she owned the path, heels clicking on the stone with the confidence of someone used to getting her way. I was midway through repainting the trim around the parlor windows when I heard the knock, steady and entitled. "Mr. Miller?" she asked, her smile perfectly rehearsed, the kind that never quite reaches the eyes. "Karen Grace. I'm the president of the Maple Hollow Preserve HOA. I was hoping we could chat for a few minutes." I stepped down from the ladder, wiping my hands on an old rag, already bracing myself. "Sure," I said cautiously, nodding toward one of the porch chairs. "Have a seat?" She didn't. Instead, she opened a slim leather folder and pulled out a set of documents with highlighted sections and a mock-up rendering of what looked like a garden plaza. "We've been discussing future development plans and your property. Well, it sits right in the heart of our community. Some of the board members thought it might be the perfect space for a public recreation area. A garden, maybe a small playground, even a community greenhouse. It would be a wonderful improvement for everyone." I tilted my head, already feeling the tension creep into my shoulders. "Karen, this is my home, not a future development site." She nodded, still smiling as if I hadn't spoken. Of course. We understand your emotional attachment to the property, but we're prepared to offer you $130,000 for it. It's a very generous offer considering the age of the structure and its current condition. You'd be free of the upkeep, the isolation, and we'd even provide moving assistance if needed." I actually laughed. I couldn't help it. "Karen, this land is worth over $600,000, maybe more. And you think I'd sell it for pennies because you want a community rose garden?" Her smile froze, then thinned into something tighter, more mechanical. "Mr. Miller, surely you understand the benefits of cooperation. This neighborhood thrives on unity. Your property, charming as it is, doesn't exactly blend in with the aesthetic of Maple Hollow. It's creating tension. I stepped closer, meeting her gaze without blinking. This house has been here for over a century. It was built when this town was nothing but train tracks and farmland. My grandfather raised his family here. I'm not selling it. Not for your garden, not for your aesthetic, and definitely not for $130,000. Something shifted in her posture. The pretense of civility cracked just slightly. Her eyes narrowed, the corners of her mouth twitching as if trying to recover the smile. She slid the papers back into her folder, clicked it shut with a snap. "Well," she said tightly, "that's disappointing. But perhaps we'll revisit this discussion when you've had time to reflect." And with that, she turned on her heel and walked back down the steps, leaving behind a faint trail of floral perfume and unspoken threats. I watched her drive away, her SUV gliding past my rusted gate like a shark cruising the edge of its tank. I knew then that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. It started subtly, like a low hum in the background of an otherwise quiet life. A week after Karen's offer, I noticed the first anonymous complaint taped to my mailbox. It was written in polite legalese, but the message was clear. Concerned neighbors were worried about the structural integrity of my house, dangerous roofing elements, deteriorating porch columns, exposed lead-based paint. The letter advised I have the building inspected before someone got hurt. The envelope bore no return address, but the HOA watermark on the header might as well have been Karen's signature. 2 days later, a work crew arrived at the border of my property. No notice, no explanation, just the sound of jackhammers and concrete saws screaming through the morning air. I walked down the driveway and asked the foreman what was going on. He told me the HOA had commissioned community sidewalk expansion and landscape beautification along the perimeter. Funny, since their sidewalk stopped exactly where my land began. But that didn't stop them from stirring up a storm of dust and debris, kicking gravel across my yard, and blocking my driveway with pallets of paving stones. When I asked Karen directly about it, she smiled and told me, "Oh, we just assumed you'd be on board with making the community a little more walkable." The same week, the streetlights lining the stretch of road leading to my house went dark. At first, I thought it was a routine outage, but after calling the power company, I learned they'd been deliberately disabled, at the request of the HOA, citing maintenance concerns. Conveniently, no such repairs were scheduled. For the next 10 days, my end of the block sat in pitch black every night, while the rest of Maple Hollow glowed like a Christmas catalog. Delivery drivers started getting lost. One of my clients nearly drove into the drainage ditch out front. Then came the trash. I found it one morning, right at the end of my walkway, a torn black garbage bag spilling fast food wrappers and broken glass across my front gate. On top, perched like a cherry on a sundae, was a handwritten note scrawled in loopy cursive. "Time to move on. Make room for the future." No signature, of course, but it didn't take a handwriting analyst to guess the author. That was when the county assessor showed up. Unannounced, clipboard in hand, apologetic, but firm. He'd received a tip, he said, concerns that the property hadn't been properly reevaluated in decades. Now suddenly, my taxes were under review. I brought him inside, gave him a tour, answered his questions. He seemed to sympathize, but his hands were tied. As he left, he admitted quietly, "It's not the first time I've been called out here. Some of the HOA folks, they're persistent." I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was noise, that it would pass. But I couldn't deny the pattern. Every day, something new, some new coincidence or inconvenience. A neighbor's dog let loose to dig up my flower beds. Someone accidentally backing a golf cart into my mailbox. Cold stares at the grocery store. Conversations that stopped when I walked by. They wanted me gone. But what they didn't know, what Karen refused to understand, was that I'd faced worse. And I wasn't going anywhere. By the third week of their nonsense, I stopped waiting for the next shoe to drop and decided it was time to lace up my own boots. I wasn't just going to endure their games. I was going to find out why they were playing so hard in the first place. Because, make no mistake, this wasn't random. It wasn't just about aesthetics or someone offended by old brick and peeling paint. This was a campaign. Coordinated, deliberate, and fueled by something deeper than HOA pride. The clue came in the form of a glossy flyer left wedged under my windshield wiper while I was parked outside the hardware store. Coming soon. The Maple Hollow Preserve Community Pavilion. I stared at it for a long minute. The mock-up was polished, landscaped walkways, an amphitheater, a fitness center, even a rooftop cafe. But the thing that made me blink was the location. Right in the center of the design, where the map showed a spacious central park, that was my land. The flyer didn't name it. There was no label, but the placement was clear. My home had been erased from the blueprint like a coffee stain photoshopped out of a real estate brochure. According to this plan, my house didn't exist. My land was just another plot waiting to be molded. That was the moment everything snapped into focus. I went home, pulled out the documents my grandfather left me, deed, plat maps, property boundaries, the old title transfers. Then I spent 2 full days at the county records office. I combed through HOA filings, property zoning proposals, city planning board minutes. It took hours of flipping through dusty folders and digging through digital archives, but eventually I found the smoking gun, a proposal from Maple Hollow Preserve Development, LLC, to expand the HOA footprint by incorporating adjacent, unutilized land for a flagship community facility. Attached to the proposal was a letter of intent between the HOA and a private construction firm, Merrick and Pine Development, agreeing to a build-out pending acquisition of the final parcel. My parcel. They'd already signed the contracts. The plans were set. Permits were in pre-approval. Construction bids submitted. Only one problem: I hadn't agreed to sell. I hadn't even been informed. They were building a dream on the assumption that I'd fold or be pushed. I dug deeper. My property, as I suspected, was never part of the Maple Hollow HOA. In fact, according to the legal boundary filings, it couldn't be. The HOA covenants only applied to homes built within the subdivision's original development zone. My house, standing since 1905, had been explicitly excluded when the zoning district was approved. My grandfather had gone out of his way to file a rider ensuring the land remained independent, and he'd even applied for and been granted historical designation status with the state. I pulled up the case number and contacted the State Historic Preservation Office. They confirmed the Miller House was a protected site. It had been registered nearly 30 years ago, and no modification, demolition, or transfer of land use could occur without going through an exhaustive process involving public hearings and state-level approval. Karen didn't just overlook that, she ignored it. Or worse, she assumed I wouldn't know to fight back. Armed with everything, I made a dozen copies. I stored them digitally, printed them, emailed them to myself, to a lawyer friend in town, and even mailed one to a P.O. box I kept in the next county. If they were going to play dirty, I was going to play smart. The moment Karen or the HOA tried anything else, I would be ready, with paper, law, and fire. They thought I was just another homeowner clinging to an old house. What they didn't realize was that I knew every nail, every board, every root in that soil. That land didn't just belong to me. I belonged to it. It happened on a Sunday morning, bright and unassuming, the kind of day that made the house look like something from a postcard, mist lifting off the lawn, light catching the stained glass panels in the front door, the porch creaking softly in the breeze. I had just finished making coffee and was heading out with my mug when I saw it. The iron garden gate had been forced open, not swung wide like someone had forgotten to latch it. No, bent. The hinges had been wrenched, one of them torn half from the brick post. My breath caught in my throat. I stepped outside, cautiously scanning the property. At first, I didn't see anyone. Then I rounded the hedges and froze. A white security SUV, emblazoned with the Maple Hollow Preserve logo, was parked inside my fence line. A uniformed man stood at the base of my front steps, clipboard in hand, sunglasses on, posture stiff like a mall cop playing soldier. Behind him, a bright red sign had been staked into the lawn. Property reserved for development by Maple Hollow Preserve HOA. For a moment, I genuinely thought I was hallucinating. "You lost?" I asked, walking up slowly. The man turned. "Sir, I need you to vacate the premises immediately." I blinked. "You... what?" "This structure has been scheduled for preliminary assessment and demolition. As of this morning, the Homeowners Association has assumed jurisdiction of this land per directive from President Karen Grace." I laughed, not nervously, not in disbelief, just pure, unfiltered incredulity. "You're standing on private property," I said flatly. "This house isn't part of your HOA, and it never has been. You're trespassing." "I've been instructed not to leave until the property is cleared," he replied, shifting uncomfortably. "If you refuse to comply, the HOA board may pursue legal action." Well, that's perfect, I said, already pulling out my phone, because I'm about to call the real legal authority. I didn't wait for a reply. I stepped back inside and called the police. While I waited, I pulled up all my documents, the deed, the survey, the historic designation, everything. I loaded the footage from my security cameras, clear shots of the gate being forced, the sign being planted, the SUV crossing my lawn. 20 minutes later, 2 squad cars rolled up. I met them at the drive, waving them over. As soon as the officers saw the damage to the gate and the bold red sign in my lawn, their expressions darkened. One officer, Sergeant Daniels, whom I'd spoken to before about the HOA's previous antics, shook his head. They've really done it now. We were halfway through me showing the footage when a sleek Lexus tore up the street and skidded to a stop behind the patrol cars. Out stepped Karen Grace, heels clicking furiously on the asphalt. She didn't even wait for pleasantries. She stormed up the walkway like a woman possessed. "Officers, this is a misunderstanding," she declared, voice tight with urgency. "I'm the HOA president, and I authorize this. We have documentation." "You have nothing," I snapped. "You broke onto my land, tried to claim it publicly, and now you're here trying to talk your way out of it?" "Mr. Miller is mistaken," she said, forcing a smile at the officers. "This property is part of our long-term development plan, and as such..." Sergeant Daniels held up a hand. "Ma'am, this land is not under your jurisdiction. We've reviewed Mr. Miller's documentation, and everything is in order. You and your security detail are in violation of several statutes, including trespassing, vandalism, and unlawful occupation." Karen's face turned pale, then flushed. "This is a mistake. I demand to see that paperwork." One of the officers began reading from my deed, pointing to the security footage paused on my phone screen. Karen stepped forward, snatched at the phone, grabbed it, and tried to pull it from the officer's hand. That was it. In seconds, the other officer moved in. "Ma'am, you're under arrest," she sputtered, demanded they call the mayor, insisted she was being harassed. It didn't matter. They cuffed her right there on my front lawn as the security guy watched, frozen, like a deer about to bolt. Karen screamed something about community standards as they led her to the cruiser, but it just echoed hollowly off the trees. That afternoon, an official inquiry was opened into Maple Hollow Preserves Board. The police confiscated HOA documents, contacted the developer named in the construction contract, and locked down any activity related to the proposed community pavilion. My security footage became evidence in a case now classified under criminal trespass and property fraud. Karen had crossed a line she couldn't uncross, and the HOA had backed her every step of the way. They thought they could erase me. But now it was their foundation that was crumbling. The fallout came fast and hard. Within 48 hours of Karen's arrest, the story had hit the local news. HOA president arrested in property dispute gone wrong. The headlines read, plastered across online articles with pictures of my front gate twisted like a pretzel, and Karen being escorted into the back of a squad car. And while she was out on bail by the next morning, the damage to her reputation and to the HOA's credibility was already done. But that didn't mean they were backing off. If anything, they doubled down. Their lawyers tried to get ahead of it, releasing a statement claiming the whole thing was a miscommunication, that the HOA had acted under the assumption that Mr. Miller's land had no clear title, and that they had merely intended to initiate a community improvement project. It was nonsense, obviously, but dangerous nonsense. Because it showed they still believed they had a chance to twist this in their favor. So I did what I had been preparing to do for weeks. I sued them. With the help of my attorney, Maria Delgado, a property rights bulldog with courtroom instincts as sharp as barbed wire, we filed a civil lawsuit for trespassing, property damage, harassment, emotional distress, and attempted fraud. We didn't just name Karen, we named the HOA as a whole, their board, the private security firm, even the developer Merrick and Pine for conspiring in an illegal land grab. We brought everything to the table. The footage, the documentation, the history of the house, and most damning of all, the signed construction contracts that proved they intended to build on land they didn't own. Their response was frantic and arrogant all at once. They tried to argue that my historical designation was irrelevant to the HOA's development authority, that my house stood in the way of progress, that my refusal to sell was malicious interference with community growth. The judge, thankfully, didn't buy any of it. Preliminary hearings went poorly for them. Karen was already facing misdemeanor charges from her arrest, and every day brought more press coverage, more public scrutiny, and more HOA residents demanding answers. Some of them even reached out to me directly, apologizing, expressing shame, saying they had no idea what their board had been doing behind closed doors. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Maria dismantled their defense like a surgeon, methodical, precise, and unstoppable. By the time closing arguments hit, the HOA's lawyers looked more like damage control agents than legal representatives. When the verdict came, it wasn't just a victory. It was an indictment. The jury found the HOA and Karen jointly liable for damages. They awarded me $95,000 in compensation for repair costs, emotional stress, and punitive damages related to the trespass and false claims. But more importantly, the judge issued a permanent injunction. The HOA was barred from any future contact, pressure, or interference regarding my property. And then came the final blow. As part of the ruling, the court ordered a state-appointed auditor to oversee a restructuring of the HOA's leadership. Karen was removed permanently. Several board members resigned before the ink dried. The developer pulled out of the pavilion project entirely, citing legal uncertainty. And just like that, the empire they tried to build on my land crumbled at the foundation. For the first time in weeks, the house was quiet again. No more flyers, no more sabotage, no more threats. The fight was over, and I had won. The silence after the storm felt almost surreal. For months, I'd lived in a battle rhythm, watching my back, checking cameras, collecting paperwork like ammunition. But now, the gates were repaired, the signs were gone, and Karen's name hadn't surfaced in weeks. Maple Hollow, once buzzing with whispers and passive-aggressive gestures, had gone still. It was the kind of quiet that comes only after something breaks and doesn't grow back the same. A week after the verdict, I received a letter from the State Historic Preservation Office. Formal and elegant, it confirmed what I'd hoped for. The Miller House had been granted expanded protective designation status, not just the building, but the land around it. A full buffer zone of 50 feet in all directions was now legally shielded from any form of encroachment, development, or structural alteration without express approval from the state. The letter concluded with a single line that made me smile. The Miller House shall stand as a recognized piece of local heritage. It is not to be moved, modified, or forgotten. I had a plaque made the next day. It arrived in a velvet-lined box, heavy bronze with raised lettering, and I mounted it just left of the front steps. The Miller House, built 1905, protected landmark, not for sale. But that wasn't enough. So I added one more sign, smaller, hand-carved, bolted to the gate. This house stood before your HOA. It stood through your HOA. And it'll stand long after your HOA is gone. I expected some pushback, maybe an anonymous complaint, a note in the mailbox, but none came. In fact, over the next few weeks, something unexpected happened. Neighbors started waving again. Not the stiff, suspicious gestures of before, but real ones, genuine, almost sheepish. A few even stopped by. One elderly man from 3 streets over brought me a pie, said he'd always admired the house from a distance. A couple with 2 kids apologized for not speaking up sooner. Even a former board member, now no longer associated with the HOA, came by to say he regretted what had happened. There was no grand apology, no big moment of redemption. Just small acknowledgments, quiet understandings that some lines shouldn't be crossed and some places aren't meant to be flattened for the sake of symmetry. On the 4th of July, I hosted a barbecue. Not a big one, just a dozen people, some folding chairs, a charcoal grill, no HOA permits, no uniformed security, no newsletter notices, just food, laughter, and the kind of community that doesn't come with bylaws. Kids ran across the lawn where I used to catch fireflies. A few folks asked about the attic, and I showed them the old maps and tools still tucked away in the rafters. As the sun dipped behind the oaks, I sat on the porch swing with a cold beer and watched the shadows stretch across the porch, just like they had when I was a kid. This house had seen generations. It had outlasted time, developers, and a woman named Karen with a clipboard full of dreams and no idea what she was up against. And now it could finally rest, unbothered, unshaken, and utterly unmovable.